Welcome to Leaders' Questions.
Deputy Bacik, please.
Well, Taoiseach, they say every day is a school day, and I think while the dawn was risen last week, we all learned something new. We all thought we knew why we have a housing crisis in this country, the #1 issue facing this country, as you've just said. We thought we had a housing crisis because of your government's policies, your government's flat refusal to restrict evictions and stop families falling into homelessness, your failure to raise building targets, and indeed your weak enforcement measures to tackle vacancy and dereliction, and your ill-conceived Planning Act, apparently drafted for and by developers. We all thought these were causal factors of the housing crisis. But after watching your bilateral press conference with US President Trump last week, I think we were all surprised to learn that, in fact, these systemic failures were not the root causes of the housing crisis. The spiralling rents, unaffordable house prices, and shamefully rising record figures in homelessness. This apparently is because we're doing so well in Ireland. It's a good problem, not a bad problem. The words of President Trump. You might clarify if it's a view you share, Taoiseach, because in reply you said, "That's a very good answer, President." I'm sure that's not the response you would give the Irish people today. And in fairness, Taoiseach, and I'll acknowledge this, you did continue on to elaborate that we do have to build more houses and we do have to build them more quickly. And I think we all agree with that. But what we're not seeing from your government is any sign of the necessary urgency or ambition or any new ideas that would actually enable us to build more homes more quickly. Take today's quarterly bulletin from the Central Bank. Forecasts for housing completions revised down again. The report calling on you to build at scale, to implement modern methods of construction, incentivise use of available land to build homes, and to deliver public infrastructure and a more effective planning regime. And we've heard these calls before, Taoiseach, from your very own Housing Commission, apart from anywhere else. Indeed, your party claimed that those policy objectives would be delivered on by what we now know to be your failed Housing for All plan and by your Planning Act, the most verbose missed opportunity in the history of the state. But under those initiatives, things have got worse, not better. Your government and the previous government have been moving at a snail's pace on housing. It's more than a year since you accepted that our ambition, at least 50,000 new build homes per year, would be needed to house the population. But still you're working towards old targets and not even meeting them. And indeed, in the general election, you and your ministers actively misled the public on the figures for housing completions. And again, we now know this. You spoke of propaganda. Well, what we heard from your government during the general election campaign was propaganda on housing. No basis, in fact. And what we now need are new ideas and some urgency. Taoiseach, will you work with us in the Labour Party? We have constructive ideas. For example, our housing solidarity bond, to redirect private investment into the building of homes, to use the money that is held on deposit in banks around the country. The central bank tells us the value of savings is higher than ever. Taoiseach, will you take on board new ideas that would actually enable us to build more homes more quickly and give our young people a hope for the future?
Deputy, I'm always open to new ideas, concrete and substantive ideas. I wasn't particularly impressed with what you put forward in the general election. I thought the idea of establishing a new national building agency would have only delayed things, would have taken years and would take years to establish, and it's kind of rolling the clock back to earlier eras, models that simply would not work now in terms of where we are in terms of house construction, models and so on, in terms of builders and so on. I mean, I don't see people in the construction sector flocking to be employees of a national building agency. The legislation that would be required and so on to establish all of that. And you lacked conviction. And even when I met you afterwards in terms of the formation of government talks, I think there was no fleshing out of your policies. There was no clear blueprint, no paper in respect to how this agency was going to be established. But if you have other ideas, fine. But they have to be focused on getting more houses built and getting them built faster, which I have said consistently over the last while. Now, from about 2020 onwards, about 130,000 new homes were built. That's more than anything in the previous decade or more. So momentum did switch. There was a turn and there was a significant shift in momentum in terms of house construction. But given the population growth in this country, which has been quite significant over the last decade or a half, we need to build more and we need to build them faster. Now, this government, 2 months in office, essentially, or 2 and a bit, 2 months in office, despite your best efforts, 800 million extra on top of the outturn last year allocated to housing, in terms of 450 million for 3,000 new homes, and also funding to fund substantial numbers of tenant in situ homes as well, and that particular programme. The state's investment is quite enormous relative to historic norms in respect to housing in this country. And that is why I'm saying, parallel with that, there simply has to be a greater degree of private sector investment. And if you look at the fall off last year, apartment blocks and apartment buildings is a huge area of concern. You criticise the Planning Act, which took us about 3 years to get through this House, right, despite all the pre-leg and all the rest of it. But it is the most substantive and important piece of legislation to enable us to streamline planning decisions, planning timelines, through the new planning commission, and also then in terms of and the national planning framework is key to zoning more land, so that we can get more houses built more quickly. And that's a very important piece of work that we'll roll out. Government will approve this very shortly. Obviously, the county councils and the city councils will then have to change their plans to allow for more zoning, to allow more houses to be constructed.
Thank you. Deputy Bacik.
Well, Taoiseach, you say you're open to new ideas on housing. But every time anyone in opposition raises a new idea with you, you never miss an opportunity to denigrate it and belittle it. As you well know, the Labour proposal in our manifesto clearly set out was to scale up the existing Land Development Agency, which we from opposition had supported, in order to ensure that the state could bear the risk of building up front. Because what I'm hearing from builders, from developers around the country, is that they desperately need upfront financing, and that the absence of that is what is causing that downward trend, that drop in momentum towards construction of apartments and of houses. You say momentum's with you. It's not. I'm looking at the central bank report today. The wording in that is about downward momentum, about a drop in completions, a projected drops in completions, because financing is not there. We in Labour are offering you a constructive proposal to develop a new financing model, a housing solidarity bond. You haven't even responded to my question about it. So I think, Taoiseach, with respect, people will take with a large pinch of salt your claim to be willing and open to take up new ideas to actually deliver more homes more quickly. People see for themselves homes are not being delivered by this government, and nor were they by the previous government.
Well, I'd appreciate if you can send me a paper on the Housing Solidarity Fund. It's a headline at the moment, but if you can send me a paper on it, certainly we'll examine it. But in terms of effectively, the Krell initiative, for example, and the LDA has effectively been upfronting in terms of financing a lot of private sector housing. That's de facto what's happening right now through the LDA. And there is an issue with the cost of financing, but the state can't be the first and last bank of resort in respect of house construction. The state has huge, up to 6 billion plus now, probably up to 7 billion this year and more, in terms of the totality of state spending on housing. So whatever way you look at it, I think we do have to look at the cost of financing. I think I've mentioned here that the commercial banks have to do more in respect of lending at sustainable rates to builders to build in the private sector. And that is work that we will continue to focus on. But as of now, the state already is in the space of facilitating, if you like, acting as a catalyst in terms of getting private sector in with sort of state underpinning, essentially.
Deputy O'Callaghan.
Like, share, and subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.